Okay, I'm pleased to welcome Marlies Schneider for the first research session of today, the conference. Marlies is a PhD candidate at the Munich Center for Technology and Society at the Technical University of Munich. And she employs qualitative research methods to study technological and social innovation, agriculture, and rural studies. Her goal is to create positive change in society by centrally focusing on groups often left out of the conversation. And in this case, and today's research example, migrant workers on Bavarian's hops farms. So Marlies, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I'm so happy to be here. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining my session. I will share my screen now and without further ado, begin my presentation. So I am doing research session 1, Saving Bavarian Hops During the Coronavirus Pandemic, Changing Perceptions of Agriculture. And Hannah said it all. I'm a PhD student at what is now called the Department of Science, Technology, and Society at the Technical University of Munich, pursuing a PhD in STS. So just for a little introduction, I'm sure we can all look back and remember 2020, February, March, and what it felt like to be at the beginning of a pandemic. There were a lot of changes that happened in our lives. Some were just slight, small changes, and some were quite drastic. And one of the most drastic changes that happened as I was living in Munich, in Germany, was that the borders in the EU closed. So from one country to another, where there would normally be open borders and freedom to move around, there were no longer. And this was to protect people from spreading the virus and to keep people in one place and hope that we could get this pandemic under control. 2 years later, it seems that strategy didn't work, but alas, this is where my research began. So just to put you in my shoes, I was beginning my master's thesis, and my plan was to travel all over the world and look at food systems and look at innovation policies and how those are implemented. And when I realized that traveling all over the world would not be possible, I decided to look at something a little closer to what I call home, around Munich. And what happened when Germany closed the borders was that farmers in Bavaria, in the surroundings of Munich, were missing a lot of their workers. And this became known as the missing 300,000 migrant workers. It became apparent to people living in Germany that migrant workers were the base of our food system here, and that we really depended on them to produce a lot of crops. So the government responded to this, and one of their solutions was to create chartered flights and bring 80,000 workers from Eastern Europe, and these are places like Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, and bring them to help farmers for the crops that they needed them most at that time. And that included asparagus, but we know in Germany it's Spargel, strawberries, and hops. But 80,000 wasn't enough. So the government also put out calls for additional replacement workers. And this is a term I made up, workers to replace migrants. And most of these people that stepped forward were people like me. They were students who had jobs at restaurants, or they were flight attendants, or they were anyone whose job was not possible due to the restrictions in Germany at the time of COVID and when it began. So how did I get involved? Well, there was a website called Das Land Hilft. In English, that means the country helps. And this was to connect anybody who had time and who wanted to participate with farmers around Germany who were looking desperately for workers. And I looked into this website and thought, this could be a really interesting research case for me, and this could be an area that I can explore. So I decided to go to a farm in the Hallertau region of Germany. So that brings me to my research setting. Here's a little very sped up video of me doing the very monotonous and back-breaking work of hops farming. I landed on a 5-acre hops farm in Ettenhofen, Germany. This is quite small for a hops farm, and it only usually employed 10 migrant workers. So to give you a little context, most farms will employ 50 at least. So this was a very small family farm. They were not entirely dependent on their hops product, but it was a significant part of their income, and it was very important to farm these crops. Just to give you a little background on the Hallertau region, which is where I ended up, this is home to 83% of hops growers in Germany. And some families there have been farming hops for hundreds of years. So hops are necessary to produce beer, which if anyone here knows anything about Germany, it's very culturally relevant, as well as a huge part of our food system and something that most people consume on a weekly basis. So just to give you some background on my field work, I went here for 1 week. That was all that was required for this kind of work. I spent about 11 hours per day on the field, making 11 euros per hour. And we started around 6 a.m. every day. I stayed with a few other replacement workers who also happened to be students from Munich, and we were able to stay in the farmer's house in his guest room. And when I was there, I decided this was going to be my research project, that I really wanted to study this whole situation, which was very unusual and in my mind, a once in a lifetime experience. So that brings me to my research goal. I decided this was a really unique opportunity to do real-time research with actors who were involved in hops production during the pandemic. So I decided my goal there was to really get into the heads of not only replacement workers, but also the farmers, try to understand their experiences and try to interpret how their perspectives changed during COVID. So here were my research questions, more specifically, how did COVID impact farmers' understanding of labor?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we don't see the slides moving.
Oh no.
Just try it again. I can help you. I will let you know as soon. Ah, yeah, perfect. Okay.
Now it works?
Yeah, so we missed the picture of you sitting in the hops field. You have to show that.
I will show it again. I'm so sorry. Thank you for interrupting. Okay, well, this was the former slide. And yeah, now I can move on. So this is my research goal. Yeah. And I think I was on my second question, which was how COVID influenced replacement workers like students or flight attendants who actually went into the field for the first time in their lives. How did they understand the agricultural system? And finally, what did these changes in our perspectives reveal about the treatment of migrant workers in Germany and beyond? So these are the questions I was exploring, and that was my goal with doing fieldwork on a hops farm. To talk a little bit about my research design, I use qualitative research as my blanket approach to my research because I really wanted to focus on this deep exploration of one case, and qualitative methods really allowed me to do that. I did a case study on this Bavarian hops farm where I performed ethnographic research, which meant spending 1 week, all of my time on this hops farm, writing field notes every night, observing different scenarios, overhearing conversations, speaking a lot with the people around me. And following up on this, I performed 20 semi-structured interviews, and those were achieved by using snowball sampling. So I created this graphic myself just to give you an idea of how I reached these people. I am in the center. All of the blue people are replacement workers. All of the red are farmers. In the green are two people that worked at institutions or organizations that tried to help farmers reach students. So just to describe it a bit, I was on a farm with farmer CE. The farmers wanted to remain anonymous, and Alex, Regina, and Sarah were on the farm with me. Those are the thick lines. Sarah introduced me to 3 other replacement workers. I managed to reach many others just by putting out, for example, a story on Instagram. If anybody worked on a farm, please contact me, asking friends of friends to introduce me. So I was able to reach 20 people and speak with them about this experience.
Still can't see your slides moving.
No,
I'm so no worries.
Let's try it again.
Okay. It would be a shame not to see the great presentation slides. So
does it work now?
Move it for one slide. No, doesn't work.
Okay.
No worries. So take your time.
Does it work now?
Mm-mm.
That's very odd. Okay. Maybe I will try sharing my entire screen and see if this works. Does this work?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
So.
Can you see the slide?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then I will continue this way.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for letting me know. I'm sorry about that. So I will move on and talk about my method. As everyone begins a master's thesis, my first job was to gather literature. So this included my theory. And because this was a very present case happening in the moment, lots of news articles. While gathering this literature, I was very organized and I wrote myself summary memos. So in MaxQDA, you have the option to write memos. I wrote summaries of most of my literature and just a few words about each news article as I imported it. And what was really helpful to me was to use the color coding to highlight the relevant sections of text. So before I was even ready to start analyzing my data, I already went through and highlighted it with different colors. For example, I used yellow for any theory related work. I used green for any current event work or anything related to COVID, and red for migrant workers. So I had a system where I was able to highlight, and that prepared me a little bit for coding eventually. I transcribed all 20 interviews, which were about 30 minutes each, using the MaxQDA 2020 transcription tool. I found that very, very helpful because unlike other transcription tools, it really allowed me to engage. I mean, I like to transcribe myself, even though, for example, Otter.ai is super helpful and very quick. I find it very advantageous to listen to the interview again, to really engage with it and to hear the voices of the people as they describe different moments in their lives. So that was useful to me. And then I employed inductive coding on interviews, literature, and field notes using MaxQDA code system to create codes and also my code book. So maybe just to describe this a little more, inductive coding means that you are applying codes as they emerge during data collection. So you're not using a predefined list of codes, you are just watching what emerges in your data. So then I did 2 cycles of coding. I did first and second cycle. For the first cycle, I used both elemental and effective methods. So elemental approach includes descriptive coding, which just means adding labels, words, or phrases to summarize basic ideas of a data point. So this is most often used for field notes and interview transcripts. That was really perfect for me. And then the effective approach is what's called emotion coding. And this is a label for an individual's lived experience and associated feelings. And I found that was extremely useful for talking to replacement workers and farmers because there was a lot of emotion involved. This was a quickly changing period of time for all of us and a very stressful and emotional time. So that was a very necessary coding approach for me. So second cycle coding for me was developing pattern codes. And this is a way of grouping my summaries into a smaller number of categories or themes. So this basically helped me condense my first cycle codes, and I had probably 100 to determine the more broader categories. And then the patterns helped me approach my main findings. And just to speak a little bit more on pattern codes, what I found really helpful in MaxQDA was this creative coding application where you can basically take all of your codes and see them on one page. And that really helped me to move them around and try to see which codes matched each other, which ones were very similar that they could be combined, which ones were more broad, which ones were more specific. And that really helped me work my codes into patterns. So create parent codes and subcodes of those codes. And yeah, creative coding was definitely useful for me. And out of that, I basically found 4 patterns. One of them was emotions, which I mentioned before. And this was a pattern that I saw lots of people were describing their situation and how they felt during that time. One of them was this relationship between society and agriculture. And that came up a lot because replacement workers were reevaluating this broader relationship that we have with our food system. Another one was just very general, and this was the agricultural workers' perspectives. So this was replacement workers, farmers, and migrant workers, and their relationships and perspectives between each other. And then finally, of course, this was unavoidable, but agriculture and COVID. And this was really any time that an interviewee would connect certain events with COVID and talk about what COVID showed them and how the pandemic influenced their perspectives. So this brings me to my findings. One thing that was very useful to me was this MaxPDA word cloud, and I actually was able to put this into my thesis. And the reason this was so useful is because I was able to see all my codes, and as you see, I color coded them according to my patterns. So if I can go back, you can see emotions are red, and then hard work was grateful, learning, joy. These were some of the emotions that people felt. So I color coded them myself, but this word cloud really helped me see within which patterns, which codes meant the most. And it kind of helped me pull out my major findings and just see, what jumps out the most, what was mentioned the most, what codes came up again and again and again. And you can see that with how large they are. So parallel universe, for example, was a very popular one that came up many, many times in almost every interview. And that brings me to my key findings. So from the code cloud, I was able to determine 3 major findings, one of them being the parallel universe / corona bubble. And this is actually a verbatim quote from multiple interviews, is that replacement workers described being at farms as a parallel universe and a bubble and something that was completely disconnected and decontextualized from the situation at hand. So while this was an escape for replacement workers like myself to get out of the city, to be outside, to earn money while working, to not have all of these COVID restrictions on top of us, to not have to wear a mask in the fields, what it also did was create this space for replacement workers to understand what migrant work is really like, and to understand these complex ties between migrant workers and farmers, because what they came to realize was that it wasn't always a completely powerless situation for migrant workers. There was actually a lot of respect from farmers, and farmers felt like their migrant workers were family, even if they were treated a little differently than the replacement workers who were mostly German. So this brings me to the treatment of migrant workers. As I mentioned before, for example, many were flown in to farm asparagus, and with these chartered flights, there weren't necessarily COVID safety measures, although that was what was promised by the German government. Unfortunately, many weren't provided personal protective equipment, PPE, like masks or gloves. Many of them had to stay in the same housing that they had before COVID, which was very overcrowded and didn't allow for any isolation. And even a worker died on an asparagus farm in 2020. So this kind of shone a light on the conditions of migrant workers and how they did not get any special treatment during COVID. In fact, it was more dangerous than usual. And in that space, replacement workers realized that migrant workers were paid a lot less than they were for the exact same work. And I even was able to interview some replacement workers who worked alongside migrant workers who are either flown in or stuck in Germany during the pandemic. And they noticed they were paid 11 euros an hour while the migrant workers were only paid 9. And they had some trouble with that. And they really felt that this was inappropriate and unfair. And yeah, that brings me to my third finding. This was the idea of essential work. So Germany had this policy basically where if you were what they called an essential worker, so a nurse or somebody who drives the subway or someone who works in a grocery store, that you had to go to work, that you had to do your job to keep the economy running, for survival of society, for any of those reasons. And they labeled agricultural work as essential. However, a lot of people felt that harvesting crops like asparagus or strawberries or even hops didn't really justify the 80,000 workers coming to Germany, because these aren't crops that we need to survive. But at the same time, it is essential to someone's survival. So a lot of the income for farmers, that's their main source of income. And they felt very strongly that this was essential work. So it became quite complicated. And temporary workers really struggled with this idea of who decides what's essential and who decides what treatment that person gets. And, everyone was coming out on their balconies and cheering for the nurses and the doctors coming home from the hospital, but no one was doing that for migrant workers who were risking their lives and their health to come to Germany. And many people argued, well, that was their choice. And while that technically was their choice, at the same time, maybe they depend on this work for their family's well-being. So in the end, it felt like a very vicious cycle of, this is our system, this is the way it is. And even COVID won't change this. But replacement workers, students from Munich, got to see this firsthand, and a lot of their perspectives changed. And that suggested to me that there might be change in the future. So in conclusion, just to summarize a little bit, COVID definitely did change perspectives on a lot of things, but also on small things like German hops production. And being able to bring various populations of people really helped reveal the agricultural and food system in Germany and show people what happens behind the scenes and things they might never think of when they drink a beer in a beer garden in Munich. They might never think of a Polish worker spending 12 hours a day on his hands and knees in a dirty field for €9 an hour to provide that beer. Migrant workers have been and continue to be a very vulnerable population in all countries that have them. And I think this was especially shown in Spain, where migrant workers were protesting their conditions and dying from COVID. And it was very present for a few months. And now that conversation has kind of gone away. So I really encourage people to continue this type of research, that we should really be paying attention to the impacts of COVID, not just on our healthcare, not just on work from home and remote work and Netflix consumption, but on those most vulnerable populations like migrant agricultural workers who help uphold our food system and get us beer. So just some lessons and takeaways about MaxQDA that I really wanted to share. Without MaxQDA, I could not have done this project. I'm a very visual person, and to work with a lot of data and different types of data, it was very helpful to have this platform, which really allowed me to, visualize everything, to organize it really well. I used the folders. I had my interviews in one, my literature in one, my field notes in one, and my news articles in one. And the coding organization and color coding especially really helped me clarify my code families, especially when I was doing creative coding, to make them different colors and to be able to recognize my patterns through those colors was very, very helpful. Some missed opportunities in MaxQDA that I wish I'd known when I was doing this research. First of all, I use Zotero for all of my citations and my citation management. And I did not know there was a Zotero MaxQDA integration. I know that now, but it would have been really helpful for me 2 years ago to import my literature and to have all of it in one place. So that's something that I will use in the future. And then the other thing that I learned about after my project that I will use now is automatic coding of text segments. And I think this would have been really, really helpful for me in my literature in places where there's a lot of reading and a lot of digging to find one key piece of information. For example, when I'm reading through policy briefs about migrant workers and looking at COVID rules, that sometimes that was hundreds of pages of very nitty-gritty detail and policy information that I didn't need to know, but I really needed to know, migrant worker payment, for example. And if I had used the automatic coding, it would have been a lot easier for me to pull out that information quickly and help me be more efficient in my work. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so sorry about the slide issues, but I'm very excited to hear your questions. And yeah, once again, thanks for listening to this research. Okay. So I have to see if there are questions in the chat, I think, because
I can help you with that if you want.
Okay, so, that would be great.
Uti Kukil wrote, "Hi Marlies, this is an interesting research. Can you please share the MaxQDA maps created during the analysis? Will it be possible to relate the process of the analysis, themes and sub-themes, and how you arrive at the key findings? Thank you."
Yeah, I don't have the map right now. I would have to open MaxQDA. What was the second question? It was just to visualize the themes and sub-themes.
Will it be possible to relate the process of the analysis, themes and sub-themes, and how you arrive at the key findings?
Sure, I can definitely talk about that. It's a bit weird without visualization, and because it's a process that you do over time. I mean, I had so many iterations of having these themes and sub-themes and parent codes. And so basically I laid out all my codes with absolutely no organization. I did my first cycle of just coding everything as I went along. And when I went back to try to organize, and I had so many codes, I decided to use the creative coding and just start to recognize what codes were similar. And for example, I started with emotions because it was very easy to look at my codes and say, okay, this person said happy, this person said sad, this person said difficult, and to take all those emotions and put them in one spot. And I think for me, I started with that area, and then I moved into, you know, broader codes and more granular codes. So I really focused on, this is a very broad idea. So some of those broad ideas might have been like unfair treatment of migrant workers, but then one of the more granular codes might have been payment. And then another more granular code might have been housing. And so I tried to look at it from two different perspectives. You know, what category is this? Is it an emotion? Is it a detail of our actual experience? Is it a change in perspective? Does it have to do with COVID? And then I tried to group it by broad versus detailed. And I used those broad codes as my parent codes and then put the detailed under as subcodes. And sometimes I would discover that there was a detail of a detail. So maybe in payment, so migrant workers are paid less, I would discover, okay, migrant workers are always paid this amount, and during COVID they didn't get more, while replacement workers got more than migrant workers. And then I would try to find why that was. So I hope that answered your question a little bit. I'm sorry I can't share my MaxQDA right now. It's a bit of a mess at the moment because this project is 2 years old and I've continued to do some work on it here and there. But thank you so much for the question. Okay, let me see if I can find another question in here. There's a lot coming in through the chat, sorry. I just see one from Ray Ambrosi. Did you color highlighting in MaxQDA or in a PDF editor and then import the PDFs into MaxQDA? I color highlighted in MaxQDA. I actually started using MaxQDA as my main organization for all of my literature, and I do that today with my PhD project, which is a little bit different from my master's thesis. And I just use it from the beginning as a place to hold all of my work and to organize it. And I do all my reading in MaxQDA as well. So as I read something, I can connect it to my research no matter what it is. And I just find that to be the easiest way for me. Matthew Loxton was surprised at the colors in my word cloud. Those were from the colors I gave the codes, but I did that myself. I don't think that MaxQDA has that ability. Maybe in the 2022 it does, but it certainly didn't in 2020. So I had to carry over colors myself from my patterns to my word cloud. Let's see what else I can find. Thank you all so much for being here, by the way. I really appreciate you watching this, and it's very exciting to be able to share my research with you. I haven't been able to present this anywhere else yet, but it's very cool. And I'm sorry about the slides. I'm seeing a lot of messages saying that you don't see my slides. That Q&A, that is easier. Okay. I think I see one from Alina that just came in. How do I work with my literature in MaxQDA? I just, as soon as I find a paper, I save it to Zotero and then import it to MaxQDA, and I read it in MaxQDA and do my highlighting there. And I've kind of stuck with this idea of highlighting before coding. So I have, for example, my current project is on innovation in lagging regions. And so I like to do yellow for innovation studies. I study STS, so maybe purple for anything STS related. And I keep doing that. So even though my project won't be done for another 3 years, I can always go back and always have my literature that I've read throughout my entire project. And I did this with my thesis as well. Okay. I think if I'm scrolling through to see if there's any other questions in here, but I think that I answered all of them. I will also share in the chat if anyone is interested. I did publish a paper on this research. So it's a little different from what I presented today because it goes much more into theory. But thank you all for sharing your interest. If you're interested, I will just share my paper in here as well if you wanted to find out more about the actual research. I see a question, did I describe the interviews directly on MaxQDA? Yes, I did. I still do that today with my PhD research, and I find that easiest for me. It takes a lot of time. It's very time consuming, but I find that MaxQDA really sets it up in a way that makes it pretty easy for you to transcribe your research and your interviews. And then I already have the transcription there exactly how I want it, and I can do my coding. Someone asked why I use Zotero instead of others. I started with Zotero quite a long time ago, actually, and so I used Zotero before I even used MaxQDA. So for me, it was just easiest to use what I already know, and that's where I store all of my citation information for my papers. So it's a really great integration to have with MaxQDA. Okay, I don't see many other questions, but thank you so much for all the feedback. It's all so positive. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for presenting. It's yeah, as a German, I think it's very irritating to see in what circumstances our like favorite foods and goods are being harvested, asparagus and beer. So thank you for raising awareness to this topic, and keep on doing such things for yeah, us researchers, and keep sharing your results, and we wish you all the best for your PhD.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alice. This was our first research session, so it's very hard word for Germans spell. And we have 3 other sessions coming up. Today it's about Netflix, so it's a business research later on at 4 p.m. my time. But just look at the schedule because the times are already automatically attached to your time zone. And tomorrow there will be 2 other research sessions. Okay. Thank you so much, Marlies. Have a nice day.
You too.
The sun is shining in Munich, and yeah. See you soon.
Okay, bye everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.